Hey everybody, it's Cameron here.
And Nicole.
Welcome back to I'm Not Crazy podcast. I've been having kind of fun looking into Chicago history, some of our darker things, and I came across this. Have you heard of the Iroquois Theatre disaster?
I think I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. I didn't...
Like much things, I've heard it, but I'm not familiar.
It turns out I've actually come across this a few times, and I used to work right next to this spot and frequent this scene a lot. So it was kind of surprising when I came across this. I was like, oh, I kind of forgot about this.
Is this what you were talking about earlier, like Staten Lake?
Yep.
I used to also not work far from there also.
I was about to say, yeah, this is around kind of our old stomping grounds in downtown Chicago. So to get into this, the Iroquois Theatre fire occurred on December 30th, 1903 at the Iroquois Theatre in Chicago. It was the deadliest fire and the deadliest single building fire in U.S. history, resulting in at least 605 deaths.
So this is greater than the Chicago fire.
Oh, yeah, by quite a bit. The damage of the Chicago fire was actually quite a bit, but there are more I think the Chicago fire is something like, it's in here somewhere, but I think closer to 300 deaths.
Oh,
so this just doubled that in one building.
Okay.
This also has a lot of ghost and paranormal stuff with it. I didn't find as many one-on-one first encounter stories, but I mean, a lot of the common tropes are documented here.
Yeah.
So let's get into this a little bit. The Iroquois Theatre was located at 2428 West Randolph Street between Staten Lake and Dearborn in Chicago, Illinois. The syndicate that bankrolled its construction chose that location specifically to attract women on day trips from out of town, who they thought would be more comfortable attending a theater near police patrolled loop downtown in the shopping district.
Okay.
The theater opened on November 23rd, 1903, after numerous delays due to labor unrest, which we also talked about with the Congress Theater, see our previous episode. But they were having a lot of labor issues around this time in Chicago. And according to one writer, the unexplained inability of architect Benjamin Marshall to complete required drawings on time. So it seems like he was just shitty at his job, and the people actually building it weren't good. But we'll get into that in a second, too, because wow, is there a lot of shitty people involved on this.
Wow, whiz.
When the theater opened, drama critics raved about the architecture and the beauty. Walter K. Hill wrote in the New York Clipper, a predecessor to the Variety, that the Iroquois was the most beautiful in Chicago. And competent judges state that few theaters in America can rival its architectural perfections.
Oh.
The Iroquois had a capacity of 1,602 with 3 audience levels. The main floor, known as the orchestra, had approximately 700 seats on the same level as the foyer in the Grand Stair Hall. The second level, the dress circle or first balcony, had more than 400 seats.
That's a pretty big theater.
Yeah, it's pretty big. The third level, the gallery, had about 500 seats, and there were 4 boxes on the first level and 2 above.
Okay.
And also, to make this even crazier, at this time, it was also standing room in the back. So these were all the seats, but it was also a packed theater that day as well, as we'll find out, of just people standing and sitting in the aisles. The theater only had one entrance. A broad stairway which led from the foyer to the balcony level was also used to reach the stairs and the gallery level. The theater's design claimed it allowed patrons...
Wait, one?
It just had one entrance. It was just one big stairway that led to all the seats.
Dangerous.
Yeah, very dangerous. There's the reason we have fire code in buildings is because of this disaster.
Okay.
The theater designers claimed that this allowed patrons to see and be seen regardless of the price of the seats. However, the common stairway ignored Chicago fire ordinance that required separate stairs and exits for each balcony. The design proved to be disastrous. People exiting the gallery encountered a crowd leaving the balcony, and then people descending from the upper levels all met in the orchestra levels in the foyer. So everyone pretty much, when they were scrambling, just collided in the center so that it became a swell of people that couldn't move.
Oof.
The backstage areas were unusually large. Dressing rooms were on 5 levels, and an elevator was available to transport actors to the stage level. The fly gallery, where the scenery is hung, was also uncommonly large, so just a big piece of kindling for this, essentially. After the fire, the Iroquois was renamed and reopened as the Colonial Theatre in 1904. It remained active until the building was demolished in 1925. In 1926, it became the Oriental Theatre, which we went to see a show in sometime in, 2017 or something like that.
Is that where we saw The Illusionist?
Yeah, we saw a magic show at the Oriental. But now it is known as the Nederlander Theatre currently. It was renamed in 2019. But it is a very ornate, like the current location of this is a very ornate, pretty theater.
Yeah,
with
it's very pretty.
Sculptures and just the architecture inside is currently crazy as well. So now we have a little bit, at least, history about this building and the fire, and kind of a brief overview or summary of how maybe something ungodly terrible went wrong here.
Okay.
On December 30th, 1903, a Wednesday, the Iroquois presented a matinee performance of the popular Drury Lane musical, Mr. Bluebeard, which had been playing in the theater since opening night. And the theater had only been open for 6 weeks also before this disaster happened. It was a brand new theater.
Holy cow. Okay.
The play, a burlesque of the traditional Bluebeard folktale, featured Dan McAvoy as Bluebeard and Eddie Foy as Sister Am, a role that let him showcase his physical comedy. Dancer Bonnie Magan was also in the cast as Eimer Dash. Attendance since opening night had been disappointing. People had been driven away by poor weather, labor unrest, and just other factors that were going downtown in Chicago at the time. Mm-hmm. The December 30th performance, however, drew a much larger sellout audience. Tickets were sold for every seat in the house, plus hundreds more for standing room areas in the back of the theater. Many estimates are that it was 2,100 to 2,200 patrons in the theater, and I think we said it had, a cap of it's supposed to have a cap of 1,602, and it was closer to 2,200. So that's quite a few more people in there.
Quite a few.
To make this much more disastrous, many of the attendees were children and mothers and people coming in for the holidays as a matinee. Yeah. The standing room areas were also so crowded that many patrons sat in the aisles blocking exits. So it was just packed. At about 3:15 p.m., shortly after the beginning of the second act, 8 men and 8 women were performing the double-act musical number in the pale moonlight, with the stage illuminated in blue-tinted spotlights to suggest a night scene. Sparks from an arc light ignited a muslin curtain, probably as a result of an electrical short circuit. A stagehand tried to douse the fire with kill fire canisters that were provided, but it quickly spread to the fly gallery high above the stage. There, several thousand square feet of highly flammable painted canvas scenery flats were hung. The stage manager tried to lower the asbestos fire curtain, but it snagged and got caught on the way down. Mm-hmm. Early reports state that the asbestos curtain was stopped by a trolley wire that carried one of the acrobats over the stage, but later investigation showed that the curtain had been blocked by a light reflector which stuck out under the arch. A chemist who later tested part of the curtain, though, the asbestos curtain meant to put out the fire, stated that it was mainly wood pulp and asbestos, so it probably would have wouldn't have done anything anyway. Also, we will find this later, but sadly, that wire system that they thought caught the curtain, there was an actress who was up there at the time and was kind of abandoned, who was supposed to fly out over the crowd. It was waiting for her entrance.
So she did not make it, I assume.
No, we'll find out. She fell, and that's how she died instead of fire. But many of these people died from asphyxiation, crush, or falling, is what many of these are. Mm. So Foy, the person we said who had rushed out, who was preparing to go on stage at the time, ran out in an attempt to calm the crowd. First making sure that his young son, who was in the care of a stagehand, was taken care of, who was also in attendance. Mm-hmm. He later wrote, "It struck me as I looked out over the crowd during the first act that I've never seen so many young women and children in the audience. Even the gallery was full of mothers and children." Foy was widely seen as a hero after the fire for his courage, remaining on stage and pleading with the orchestra to continue playing as if this was the frickin' Titanic, as stagehands made futile attempts to lower the supposedly flame-retardant curtain, as we know it's snagged, and also using the kill fire extinguishers. But I have a little more on those, I think, a little bit further down, but those were just canisters full of powder that you were supposed to come up and just dump the contents on it. So a big problem that they ran into is that this fire was rising up into the canvas in the air. So them just spraying it on, it did nothing. So as I was saying, Foy was widely seen as being courageous for coming out and trying to calm down the crowd. To make this kind of more fun, he was dressed in drag at the time for the number. Oh, to make this crazy, so Foy was telling the orchestra to play on, all while parts of the scenery and the set were falling on and raining down around him in fire. Mm-hmm. Foy later wrote in his memoirs that he saw the upper levels in a mad animal-like stampede. There's screams, groans, snarls, and scuffles of thousands of feet and bodies, grinding against bodies and merging into crescendo of half wail, half roar. By this time, many of the patrons on all levels were attempting to flee the theater. Some had found that the fire exits behind the draperies on the north side of the building, but found that they could not be opened because they had unfamiliar locks on them. These were firmly locked to keep those in upper levels from sneaking down to pricier seats during intermission. So back in the day, they used to...
So they locked off?
They would lock off each section for the poorest to make sure that they couldn't get to the lower good seats. So many people up above were just trapped up there. And they were a new kind of lock that most people weren't familiar with, so that was another huge problem. Some people did manage to pick these locks to find, but they were trapped up there.
Wow, they fucked up big.
Mm-hmm. Bar owner Frank Hausman, a former baseball player from the Chicago Colts, defied an usher who refused to open the door. He was able to open the door because he had an icebox at home with a similar lock on it. Hausman credited his friend outfielder Charlie Dexter, who had just quit the Boston Beaneaters, with forcing open another door. So 2 former baseball players are the reason that at least some people got out of that level. Mm-hmm. A third door was opened by either brute force or a blast of air, but most of the other doors could not be opened. Some patrons panicked, crushing or trampling others in a desperate attempt to escape from the fire. Mm-hmm. Many were killed while trapped in dead ends or while trying to open what looked like doors with like windows in them, but they were actually just windows and decoration. So it was just an optical illusion.
I feel like usually in this scenario or in any case similar to this, people die more of just being erratic and just trampling over each other trying to survive. As opposed to like what the actual tragedy.
Oh, some people are going to start dying from fire and falling soon, but this one was made just so much worse by it. It was just, it all funneled into one column, one stairs where everyone, that's where most of the crushing came. When people came to the scene, everyone was already dead by that point who couldn't gotten out. So on the scene, they just found stacks 10 feet high of bodies in areas where they just piled up and couldn't get out. Mm-mm. The dancers on stage were also forced to flee, along with the performers backstage in the numerous dressing rooms, which we said were 5 stories and mostly you got around by elevator.
Yeah.
Several performers and stagehands facilitated an escape through the building's main rear exit, which consisted of an unusually large set of double-stacked doors that would have normally served the purpose of moving in those large, like, fly sceneries and the big drop. So it was a big, huge cargo door in the back. Mm-hmm. When this was open, an icy wind blast rushed forward, fueling the flames with air and causing the fire to grow substantially larger. The backdraft from this open door caused a sudden ball of flame to explode through the theater. The hot gases and flames passed over the heads of those in the orchestra seats and incinerated everything flammable in the gallery and dress circle levels, including the patrons trapped in those seats. So everyone that we were saying was trapped up there was almost killed instantly when they opened that door. Those in the orchestra section exited into the foyer and ran out the front door, but those in the dress circle and the gallery who escaped the fireball could not reach the foyer because the iron gates, which were closed between the performances to prevent the patrons moving to the seats, were still locked. Much like the Titanic, attendants and people in the rush just left a lot of those barred so that the poor people couldn't get out, which again, a lot of these would have been women and children there for the matinee. Okay, so this is another kind of messed up fact. As the vents above the stage were nailed or wired shut, the fireball instead traveled outward, ducking under the stuck asbestos curtain and streaking towards the vents behind the dress circle gallery about 50 feet away. So normally, because the theater fires were so common back in the day, there were special vents and stuff in the ceiling to allow it to travel up instead of just traveling into the theater. But for some reason, they nailed and wired theirs shut, so the air had nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. So it just spread straight into the audience and into the theater. The largest death toll was at the base of the stairways, where hundreds of people were trampled, crushed, or asphyxiated. Patrons who were able to escape via the emergency exits on the north side found the unfinished fire escapes. Many jumped or fell from the icy, narrow fire escapes to their deaths. The bodies of the first jumpers broke the falls of those who followed. Students from the Northwestern University building, north of the theater, tried bridging the gap with a ladder and then some boards from the rooftop, saving a few who managed to make it across, but also a lot of people were falling on these makeshift bridges and stuff and not making it over.
Yeah.
The alley between Lake and Randolph Street, going east from State Street, was called Death Alley in the newspapers the next day, and is still to this day referred to as the Alley of Death or Death Alley in Chicago. Mm-hmm. The reason so many people died in that alley is because the fire escapes were not finished. So patrons didn't realize that there wasn't enough space to hold them, and it was too late. Yeah. So the mass of people just was pushing people off. That's another area where it was said that bodies were stacked 10 feet high to the point where people started surviving the fall because they were just landing on a pile of dead bodies. Oof. Roughly 120 people ended up falling to their deaths from the escapes in the alley below. Many escaped from the burning theater through the coal hatch and through windows in the dressing rooms, but others had tried to escape via the...
But the coal hatch?
Yeah, that seems like... Yeah, I would not want to try to go there. And others tried to escape via the west stage door, which opened inward and became jammed with actors pressed towards it, trying frantically to get out.
Wow.
So the crowd's trying to go both ways, jam that area. By chance, a passing railroad agent saw the crowd pressing against the door, and he noticed what was happening. So he unfastened the hinges from the outside using tools he normally carried with him. Super lucky and random that this railroad man always has his tools on him, allowing the actors and the stagehands to escape. The fire department was nowhere to be seen yet because no alarm had been pulled to send them. A stagehand finally pulled a manual fire alarm at Randolph and Dearborn Street because there was no fire alarm connected to the building. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. They opened the front doors to find an eerie silence and the sight of dead bodies stacked up in the rows. The Iroquois had no fire alarm box or telephone.
Oh, what?
On the way to the scene at approximately 3:33, so this is what, only 15 minutes later after
easily.
all this is still just hundreds of people have already died. A member of Engine 13 activated an alarm box to call additional units. The Chicago Police Department became involved when an officer patrolling the theater district saw people emerging from the building in panic, some with their clothing on fire. The officer called in from a police box on Randolph Street, and police were summoned by whistles. Soon there was coverage on the scene to control traffic and aid with the evacuation. Some of the city's 30 uniformed police matrons were called in because so many were women and children, and they just wanted, to treat, obviously, women and children, keep the same sex. The diner next door was transformed into both morgue and hospital as doctors tried to find living victims in a sea of charred remains. Panicked family and friends soon began descending on the restaurant to see if loved ones had somehow escaped. As word of the staggering death toll spread, the city would be overcome by a state of collective mourning. And also, that restaurant, I think, is the one I worked at. I think that would have become like the Potbelly, or very close by. Or essentially, a lot of those storefronts just ended up becoming morgues and makeshift hospitals in triage at the moment. Days later, the Chicago Tribune ran a list of regulations that had been flouted by the Iroquois, including the lack of adequate fire alarm, automatic sprinklers, marked exits, or suitable fire extinguish devices. Even the 2 large flues on the roof, where the smoke and flames could have vented out, were boarded shut. The newspaper called for action. The only atonement that can be made to these hapless victims of negligence is to make the theaters of Chicago absolutely safe, so that none others may meet their fate. I also want to say that this was ironically much like the Titanic, that this burnt 6 weeks after its opening, and it was being marketed as an unburnable theater. They were saying a fire could
literally did the complete opposite.
This was during a time of a lot of
any precautions or any safety measures to even foresee worst case scenario, they neglected.
And it wasn't even like we have these because we didn't have these safety features at the time. They were neglected and flouted, and we will see it's because of the corruption of Chicago at the time that people got paid. Their fire chief just let things slide for free tickets. So things of that nature led to this. So some of the victims. So mass panic ensued. In attempting to escape the burning building, many of those trapped inside had to climb over piles of bodies to get out. Corpses were stacked 10 feet high around the blocked exits. The victims were asphyxiated by smoke and gases or crushed to death by the onrush of other terrified patrons. It's estimated that 575 people were killed on the day of the fire, and at least 30 more died of injuries following the weeks. And again, by comparison, the Great Chicago Fire killed 300 people.
Okay.
And that was the entire city.
And this was twice
One
that.
building.
Yeah.
The loss of life struck at the heart of Chicago's upper middle class society. They were, as the Great Chicago Theatre disaster described, Chicago's elect wives and children of its most prosperous businessmen of the flower and local society. Some had even traveled by train from nearby cities to enjoy the holiday atmosphere of downtown Chicago. The task of proving culpability, however, became hopelessly complex. The myriad of problems that day turned into an algebra of blame. So many had failed to carry out their duties that no one source could concretely assign sole responsibility. An official inquest focused on the theater owners, the architect, and city officials, who in turn were quick to point fingers, including at the victims themselves.
They're all at fault. There's no way that they could try to be like, oh yeah, it's this person's fault. Like, no.
And I think
it was a domino effect.
And I think in the end, because they couldn't find one person to blame, I think everyone got off on this.
As they should have.
No, like got off? Oh yeah, not like.
No, fuck that.
The owner, Will J. Davis and Harry J. Powers, issued a statement in the Tribune blaming the audience for panicking, despite being admonished to be calm and avoid any rush. The architect insisted that there were ample exits had everyone not become panic-stricken and stunned. Even though, again, we know that half these exits weren't even...
Repeat that line again?
So both the architect and the owners say it was the people's fault for becoming panicked and rushing, even though there was one exit and half the doors were fake.
I hate people.
Everybody afterward was washing their hands of responsibility. It was such a total loss of life that they didn't want to be connected to it if possible. Obviously, it was political suicide.
They dug their own grave for that one, so I don't know why they got off.
After numerous investigation, reams of testimony, and 3 years of legal wrangling, no one was ever held criminally liable.
Still crazy.
Yeah. Numerous lawsuits from victims' families died out because they got too expensive to maintain against multiple defendants. So the same thing that happens today, the big companies and the rich people were just holding out until they couldn't afford to sue them anymore, including the city owners, or the theater owners and the city. Davis was tried but not convicted. In the end, a batch of payouts to families from the construction company that had built the theater was the only concrete payout and liability.
Did they say how much the payout was?
No, but I'm sure it wasn't great.
Probably not.
An underlying culture of complacency did nothing to narrow things down. And we're also talking about a time that was notorious in patronage and payoffs. While a direct link to corruption was never proven in court, the indifference of city officials to known violations contributed to the fact that the theater received only a cursory safety inspection before opening to the public weeks earlier. Although construction ran behind schedule, the theater owners rushed it open before the lucrative holiday season. But the problems that plagued the theater were not unknown. Concerned about safety violations, Mayor Carter Harrison ordered a review of all theaters just months earlier, but lack of enthusiasm from city officials meant the investigators had petered out.
You know, the more you read this, the more irritating it is.
Oh, it gets it. Yeah, I won't get happy. I'm not going to shoot you straight. So among the enduring changes and stipulations pertaining to lighting of exits now, aisles and corridors, including requirement that a red light is kept on over all exits. Mm-hmm. So essentially because of this that we have, so you can't be in aisles. The seating arrangements, we have to, this just kind of solidified to the current fire codes that we mostly have today, from what I understand.
They should have done all this to me.
Agreed. The Iroquois fire also inspired the development of panic bars found on emergency exits. Carl Prinzler, a hardware salesman who had originally planned to attend the performance of Mr. Bluebeard on the day of the fire, went on to work with his colleagues to invent the crash bar mechanism on doors to prevent entry from the outside and also let people, safely out.
Yeah.
In New York City on New Year's Eve, some theaters eliminated standing room. Building and fire codes were subsequently reformed. Theaters were closed for retrofitting all around the country, and in some cities in Europe that entire week, everything just closed.
Okay.
All theater exits had to be clearly marked in the door configuration so that even if they could not be pulled from the outside, they could be pushed from that crash bar. After the fire, it was alleged that the fire inspectors had been bribed with free tickets to overlook code violations. The exterior of the Iroquois was largely intact. The building was later reopened as the Colonial Theater, but was demolished in 1925, so the Oriental Theater and the Nederlander are a completely separate building from that one.
Okay.
So let's just take a look at all the infractions, everything that was wrong with it. So
can't wait.
The risk inherent in flammable scenery and props were recognized even in 1903. So they had two features: a safety curtain that confined the fire to the stage, and then smoke doors that allowed heat to escape through, that were supposed to allow heat to escape through the roof, but instead it just rushed forward.
So that's what they had nailed and screened off, right?
Yeah. So pretty much because of this, it created negative pressure that as soon as they opened those blast doors for people to get out, it had a fireball that incinerated everyone in those top balconies. So I'm just going to now go quickly through all of this. Skylights on the roof and stage, they were inadequate. The curtain was not tested periodically and it got stuck. The curtain was not fireproof. It was actually heavily made of wood and would have caught fire. The evacuation, exit doors opened inward. The exits were locked. There were no exit signs. Many exits were concealed by flammable drapery so that you had to like dig through the walls to even find them. Theater staff had never had a fire drill, and they were unfamiliar with where the exits were because it was brand new. There were no emergency lighting.
Wait, weren't they open 6 weeks?
Yeah.
And they had no idea where the exits were?
They were all hidden in drapery behind the wall. They didn't know where all of them were. No, they knew where the main ones, visible ones were, but half of them were hidden and half of them were fake. Yeah. Let's see. Theater staff had never been drilled. There were no emergency lighting. So when the main auditorium they lost power at one point. It was completely pitch black. This also gave us the first like floodlights that come on in an emergency. During the performances, the stairways were blocked by the iron gates so that people couldn't get down. Many of the exit routes were confusing. People kept coming up to dead ends where they got crushed and just trapped and burned.
Yeah.
There were several ornamental doors, as I was saying, that looked like doors, but they were not. 200 people died in one of those passages that didn't end up being an exit. Iron fire escapes on the north wall led to at least 125 deaths in the alley of people falling to their death.
Okay.
So, let's talk about some hauntings. Obviously, because of all this, you might be thinking, I bet there's a lot of hauntings.
Yep.
So now that we have pretty much all the facts of the disaster itself, now we're going to get into some of the hauntings. Because as you can imagine...
Spooky
yeah, and actually, it's funny. I remember just hearing about this all the time. Right after high school, I was working downtown on State and Lake, and I used to take Death Alley, which is just an alley behind the theaters in the theater district. And I mean, it's cool back there. It's still very old timey. It has a brick sidewalk. There's show posters and movie posters up on the wall. But I mean, a lot of times, like people will go backstage. Like that's where the people come backstage to meet like the actors and actresses. You run into stagehands back there, and it's always kind of busy. But I did even remember back in the day hearing rumors that like it was super haunted in that alley, and you were supposed to hear whispers and hands touch you and stuff. So we'll get into some of these.
Did you ever feel like it was haunted?
No, it's just very nice back there. And no, it was just a shortcut to get to the train. Even though the current James N. Naderland Theater was built more than 2 decades after the Iroquois Theatre fire, paranormal activity related to the fire continues to this day. Apparitions have been observed plunging to their death, as many chose over being burned alive. The fire has been observed bursting outside the back of the theater, and the smell of smoke is not an uncommon occurrence. That's another one I always heard, that you could smell smoke back there, but I've never heard that the fireball apparently recreates itself sometimes. While on break, one of stagehand managers stepped outside to light up a cigarette. While he was looking down, he heard a voice say, "Smoke will kill ya." When he looked up, a woman in a hoop skirt and a big brown hat was standing right before him, and then disappeared. After the show, when everyone had left and he was cleaning up, he heard the toilet flush in the women's restroom, along with giggling of young girls. When he entered, nobody was there.
Dun, dun, dun.
Ghost hunting the Iroquois have been reported in and around the theater for many years. Cast and crews report that while they're rehearsing on stage, they will look up in the balcony and see shadow figures move around. People also reported seeing apparitions of strangers on the back stairs wearing period clothes from the turn of the last century. So the back stairways and the fire escapes where people fell.
Yeah.
Back when it was still the Ford Center for the Performing Arts, or the Oriental, was having a show run of Wicked, where Anna Gasteyer, a Saturday Night Live alum, has a few ghost stories for us.
Okay.
Gasteyer said what is now the Nederlander was steeped in glamour, but also described as dingy, dusty, and drafty. She described the alley behind it, Death's Alley from the Iroquois Theatre, as a place that always had the gloomiest, darkest, most dismal, terrible feeling. In 2005 and 2006, Gasteyer played Elpha, the Wicked Witch of the West, in Wicked at the Oriental Theatre. At the end of Act 1, she notes, there is a climatic moment in which the witch is learning to fly, and a huge amount of smoke and fog envelops the auditorium as the orchestra soars. While flying, Gasteyer reported she would look out over the sides and see people in the wings. She said there were a lot of stagehands on the production, but this was more people than should have been there. She said they were gathered almost like families, gatherings of people together. But then once she landed, there was nobody there. She also reported hustling down the hallways from her dressing room in the witch costume when no one was around, and reported hearing a child's voice. She said she turned a corner and found a woman at the end of a hall near the stairway. The woman had 2 children, a young girl and a boy, in turn-of-the-century period clothing.
Interesting.
My first instinct was that it was just another actor, and I nodded, and she was very stoic. She didn't smile, she just nodded back. While she turned another corner, the woman and the children were gone. When she asked one of her dressers about it later, they said it was probably just the ghost from the Iroquois. So back in Death Alley, people tend to encounter things and take strange pictures, especially along the back walls. One friend who claims to have psychic abilities and who came there a lot on ghost tours with him says that it feels too much energy in that alley and would not even walk down it. Nearby buildings have also been involved when it comes to stories about ghosts that might be connected to the Iroquois Theatre, such as the Marshall Field's department store, because they had people there using triage in a makeshift hospital. But pretty much everything around there for a second was used as a morgue hospital for a while they were trying to ID bodies. If you walk into the alley now, you might notice a chilly breeze even on the warmest day. You might hear someone whisper your name, or you might feel hands on your shoulder.
Scary.
These hands are nowhere to be seen, and no one is around you. People refer to these hands as phantom hands. However, this doesn't stop people from visiting the alley, as many people still use it to commute, as well as the actors and the stagehands.
And you.
And me. I couldn't find a lot of singular ghost stories, but I've just heard about, in particularly Death Alley, which is just a little commute you can take. And the next time you're in Chicago, it's right off State and Lake and Randolph. So, I mean, it's a very popular tourist attraction, but this is
So is it like where you go up State Street, there's going to be, it looks like, I think, on the corner of Randolph and State, I think that's where the Old Navy's at. You just take State straight up, and then, if I recall correctly, there's like, it's almost like a little walkway in between like the end of Old Navy and then like the beginning of like a news station or something like that.
Hey, but if you're coming to Chicago, go to one of the historic theaters and see yourself a show.
And then on the corner of State and Lake, that's where the Pop Alley is at.
That's where I used to work. But this is an interesting one. I know Chicago has a few other disastrous things that I'm going to touch on in future episodes, but...
Yeah, you're diving deep into Chicago history.
It's just, I was doing the Congress Plaza Hotel, and then this one popped up, and I know there's at least one ship disaster and a suicide bridge. So don't worry, folks. There's plenty of horrific Chicago history coming,
and there's probably some more that we'll uncover.
I'm sure I'll stumble across it. But this is an interesting one I kind of remember from back in the day, but you don't hear about this one often. It's crazy.
No, it's crazy because this one trumps the Chicago fire.
Yeah, it still holds the record for the worst, most casualties.
And people hear more about the Chicago fire than you do about the Iroquois fire.
Yeah, and this is way more traumatic and devastating.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, thanks for listening to our episode on the Iroquois Theatre. If you like what you heard, make sure you like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, rate and review. If you want more content, go ahead and listen to Cult Classic Podcast for movies, Urban Hermit for banter, and of course more I'm Not Crazy for all your spooky, scary unknown.
Yeah.
We'll check you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.